So, as many of you know in the fact community, fairness is a topic very often talked about in AI. There are many frameworks and formal notions of fairness in AI, and many technical and formal approaches to, for example, define, characterize, compute, and enforce fairness. However, these technical and formal approaches have limitations. They can be mutually incompatible, and specifically, importantly for our motivation, they are missing many socio-technical factors that are relevant to assessing fairness, other than quantitative measurements of bias. And in doing so, they fail to center disproportionately impacted communities. When focusing only on technical approaches to fairness, we tend to ignore value-laden choices, such as specifically, for example, the choice of definition or the choice of enforcement method that already have an influence and influence the outcome of the fairness of a process. So, what do we mean when we say that technical approaches can miss many of the socio-technical factors? Well, AI systems are not neutral, but rather they are products, and as such, they can shape and reinforce social, political, economic structures. And when talking about fairness, we have to consider these structures. For example, we have to consider the reasons as to why an AI system was introduced in the first place, who decides how they operate, who decides what is fair in the situation. So issues of power, issues of historical inequalities, epistemological standpoints are all socio-technical factors that influence our assessment of whether a situation is fair or not. So what we need is to take the focus away from formal definitions and allow for frameworks that include societal and relational factors. So this is exactly our aim. It is to provide a shared language to describe situations, in particular situations and processes that we would like to characterize as either fair or unfair to assess in terms of their fairness. And of course, we want this language to have specific structures, specific components that relate to why and how a situation can be perceived as fair or unfair. So why do we want to provide such a framework? Well, both to compare analogous situations where perhaps what can be assessed as fair is similar or the same, as well as to highlight relevant differences in the cases where fairness cannot be straightforwardly transported from one situation to another. And what we have been using it for more, and we have a few examples in our paper as well, to capture different interpretations of the same situation by different stakeholders, where different stakeholders have different perceptions of what may be fair. And by using a common shared language, it is a lot easier to characterize where those differences lie. So, just a little background on why we chose the categories that we chose. Fairness is understood very differently in different fields, sociology, philosophy, psychology, economics. And for each of these fields, traditional formalizations of fairness are based on specific models of the specific situation and are therefore difficult to adapt to a broader or a different societal context or a different field. In AI specifically, fairness is tied to non-discrimination, to bias, and to harm reduction. And this can be seen when focusing on, for example, the many different ethical guidelines and what kind of concepts they relate to fairness. So in this sense, we focus as well on an idea of fairness that is tied to non-discrimination and to bias, while keeping in mind that fairness is multidimensional. And so our aim is not to end up again in purely quantitative bias definitions, but rather to give a more descriptive language. With that said, we reach ACROCPoLis, which is the framework that we propose. ACROCPoLis is composed of actors, context, resources, outcome, criteria, power, and links. And all of these are categories within ACROCPoLis. So they are described, of course, in more detail in the paper, but I will give a quick overview here in this talk. So actors are agents in the situation under study, and they simply describe any agent that is involved in the situation in any way. So they can be individuals, groups of people, institutions. Context captures relevant structural aspects that impact the process, as well as perhaps relevant information about what the situation involves. We have a category for resources, and while it is true that fairness processes a lot of the time talk about specific redistribution of resources, we have a very broad definition of resources in which we take in a broad sense to include not just material items, but also elements such as representation, agency, legal rights, or elements such as labels can be seen as a resource. What we are evaluating is a process, and therefore we also take its outcome into consideration to assess whether it is fair or not. So outcome merely describes the final result of the process. So of course that can be a redistribution of resources, but it can also be a decision or a label given. There can be many types of outcomes. The next category is criteria, which is meant to model the specific criteria that are used to influence the outcome. So the intended and specific criteria used to influence the outcome. Finally, we have, in my opinion, what are the two very most important categories: power and links. So on the one hand, power is meant to explicitly capture which actors have power over the outcome and what kind of power that may be. And links is meant to contain basically any relationships between the previous categories that are not implied already by their definitions. So I just very quickly showing you the ontology view of our framework, but these are the relationships that are already contained in the definitions of each category. But we have an additional category, links, that explicitly is there to encode any other possible relationships that can happen between the categories that are not captured there. So for example, actors may hold power over other actors and not only over the outcome. The choice of these categories responds to growing literature calling for multidisciplinary views. And if you want to read more about why we chose the categories that we chose, please go ahead and have a look at the paper. The framework until now is mainly purely descriptive. It aims to describe a situation. When we assess the fairness of a situation, however, we enter into more normative components. By necessity, we need to make a normative assessment of whether a situation, whether we consider it as fair or not. Just very briefly, one way that we can do that is by analyzing the situation, for example, from the view of two different stakeholders and seeing in which categories or where the main differences lie in what they consider in the description of the process. And that can allow us to see where the two differences in fairness, where the differences in their fairness assessment may lie. Just to finalize, something that we need to do in future work is really consider whether this tool can be used to support design, and in particular, limitations in terms of whether the categories chosen concepts are sufficient